Thank you, Ambassador Girard-diCarlo. It is my honor to serve as the faculty director of the Girard-diCarlo Center. Let me start. I know you have the program, but I'm going to give very brief introductions for our panelists and their dazzling accomplishments. We'll go in order. To my immediate left is Bill Marimow, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, currently the Vice President of Strategic Development for the Philadelphia Inquirer's parent company, Philadelphia Media Network. He had been the editor-in-chief of the Inquirer from 06 to 10, and again from 12 until just this past spring, having also served in senior positions with National Public Radio and the Baltimore Sun. To his immediate left is Ginger Casey, an Emmy Award-winning television news journalist whose career included serving as a news anchor, reporter, talk show host, and producer for several network stations in major markets, as well as PBS from coast to coast. And finally, down at the end is Zack Stalberg, for more than 30 years, a reporter and columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, the final 20 of those years as the top editor of the Daily News. After his time there, he spent 9 years leading the venerable Philadelphia organization, the nonpartisan government watchdog group, the Committee of 70. As noted in the program, and I mention it only because it might be relevant later today, Zack first gained serious recognition in the early 1970s when he challenged Frank Rizzo, the city's then law and order mayor and a growing national figure, to take a lie detector test to uphold his claim that Mr. Rizzo did not offer a political bribe. Mr. Rizzo flunked that test. Those of you who at least get your news, and I'll ask you about that in a moment, from the major Philadelphia papers, either one, I love them both equally, by the way, gentlemen, you'll know that there was a controversy recently over the fate of a very large statue of Mayor Rizzo in Thomas Paine Plaza near the Municipal Services Building in Philadelphia across from City Hall. This is a very impressive group, and also, I think, impressive and notable because they truly want to have a conversation. Not so much with me, with each other, but especially with all of you. So they have specifically asked me to encourage questions at any time. Now, don't shout it out, but if, as we're going along, you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and at an appropriate moment, I will call on you, and the conversation will go in that direction. My hope is that the lift mics in the ceiling will be good enough for us to hear you. If not, we have crack staff who can come to you with the microphone. Before, though, I turn to the panelists, I want to just get a sense of the room. In the last week, how many of you have obtained your news? To raise your hand more than once. How many of you have obtained your news from traditional dead tree newspapers? Stalberg says no, not me. How many of you obtained your news from traditional news organizations through their website or phone app? This may not be a random sample. How many of you obtained your news from television news, broadcast network, or cable? How many of you from email summaries like The Skim or other things like that? A little bit of a demographic change. And how many of you obtained your news from your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed? And finally, from news search engines. You're interested in the story, you want to put it into Google or wherever else. All right, last question. Who trusts the news that they read and watch?
Uh-oh.
All right, so, you know, I know this isn't class, but Mr. Desir, why? Which news source do you trust and why? Say that just a little louder.
Democracy Now! Amy Goodman has been on the forefront of delivering good journalism for 30 years now.
Okay.
She's great.
And so it's her personal history that lends her credibility. And what is it that you think a respected media outlet is supposed to be doing?
delivering the facts.
Delivering the facts. Excellent. Well, some of those themes, and thank you, some of those themes that we're going to be considering today revolve around your collective answers. This idea of ethics, integrity, and civility, or the lack thereof, in media. So let me now turn to the panelists, and I'll start off with Zack. Zack, do you agree that the primary goal of traditional journalists is to deliver the facts?
I think it's the lost goal of traditional journalists, but at least theoretically it should be the goal.
So how do we know when the journalists have reached that goal?
Well, the tricky thing, I think, is you don't know. You can make a judgment based on little clues and past experience, but in these times when the media has splintered to such a degree that it's almost silly to use the word media, it's very tough to know. It's tough to be a news consumer, and the burden is on all of you to try to figure out who's delivering the facts and who you can trust.
Why do we want journalists to deliver the facts? Is there some broader objective in play?
Well, I would say that democracy works when it works because of the flow of quality information and facts, you know. And to the degree that it's not working, which I would say is very heavy right now, it impedes our ability to make judgments about, among other things, how our government is working for us.
So, Ginger, the Washington Post has a motto. I think it's fairly recent. They say, democracy dies in darkness. Is that right? It seems to be kind of what Zack said.
I absolutely agree. I think a strong democracy is based on an informed citizenry. And I think it's very important that journalists shine lights into those dark corners. That's the job of what we're supposed to be doing.
Although it does strike me as self-serving, but when they use it.
No, I think it's very important that in order for people here to be able to make informed decisions about their lives, their government, the world they live in, they need the free flow of information.
Bill, did you want to add something?
I do. Since we're in a hall primarily inhabited by law students, I would commend to every one of you Justice Brennan's decision in the great Times versus Sullivan case, which begins with these words, "We're required to decide." And when you read that case, you realize that the reason for the First Amendment, as it pertains to the press, is really so that the debate on public affairs can be robust, uninhibited, facts and opinions from all sides, so that we as citizens can make informed decisions. And I think if you haven't read Times versus Sullivan, you ought to read them all, both the majority opinion as well as the other opinions, because it gives you a sense, both a historical and constitutional sense, of why freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion is so inextricably intertwined with democracy. It's really important.
I agree. So I can't let a New York Times versus Sullivan comment pass without at least saying, I'm with you. So the media is important. Important for us to know what's going on, important for our democracy. But there are pressures on the media. Zack, what are some of the pressures on modern journalists that could challenge the ethical foundation of that enterprise?
Well, we could probably talk about it for the next hour and a half about that one, but and maybe we will, but I'd start out with a few. One, the the business model that supported good journalism for a period of time has completely collapsed, and the business pressure on to deliver quality news, that business model doesn't really exist anymore. And like everything else, journalism is driven by economics. Coming in a close second is social media and the internet in general, but the pressure of the 24/7 news cycle on in terms of delivering news, and the fact that half the people in the country, this room doesn't seem typical, but half the people in the country are now getting their news via Facebook. That is a tremendous pressure on traditional media. For me, a distant third is the president. You know, he's every president and just about every ranking political figure has had their problems with the news media, but with President Trump, we're in a whole new ballpark. To me, he's exploiting and exacerbating some of the other pressures. Finally, I guess I'd say there's a talent issue, and so some of the people that were drawn to journalism in the past now go to law school, and the talent that you could really trust is harder to find.
Ginger, is there anything different about those answers, particularly with respect to technology, from a broadcast perspective as opposed to a print perspective?
Well, I think the monetization pressures that he talks about are great across all media or all legacy media right now. For broadcast in particular, doing more with less. Newsrooms are squeezed. There are fewer reporters now, fewer fact checkers, and they send a reporter out in the morning, and the minute that reporter is handed the assignment, they're expected to start blogging, they're expected to start sending content back to the website, and they're expected to do 3 live shots and 2 packages and set it all up themselves, and quite often shoot it themselves. They bring their cameras with them now, or they use their cell phones, and they even have a little box they can carry around to do a live shot in. So what I ask all of my friends is, when are you doing any journalism? You know, they're content providers now. They're not really thinking through and thinking in terms of context about the stories they're covering as much as they are meeting deadlines to provide content to the various platforms that the news organization has. And that's extremely upsetting to the people, you know, I grew up with in the business. I think younger people coming into the business now expect this because it's the new norm. But whenever they tell someone that you're going to be a multimedia journalist, it's a fancy way of saying you're going to be a pack animal, and you're going to be expected to shoot, edit, write, produce, and get everything back, to the station without doing any comprehensive reporting. And I think in a large way, that is how so many in the what I call legacy or mainstream news organizations missed the presidency. They missed Trump's emergence, and part of that was they didn't have time to hang around in these little towns and go to the diners and ask people what they thought about living there and what their lives were like. They were just busy following the candidate and producing content. So that kind of thoughtful analysis that is so integral to good journalism is more and more lacking in media outlets.
Yeah, I can't help but saying part of that, missing that story, had to do with the elitism that exists in the media. When I started, I was almost everybody in the newsroom had a blue-collar background. you know. And so if you have a blue-collar background, you're aware of that plant that closed and the people that suffered because that plant closed. But one of the things that's happened along the way is that diversity of every sort has ceased to be a priority, including that kind of blue-collar diversity that would have allowed the rest of the country to understand what was going on, especially in the heartland.
I wanted to say a word about resources, because I believe that the economic pressures on the media have really changed the level of depth of coverage. And I'm better at showing than telling, so I'll give you an example. About 5 or 6 years ago, State Senator Vince Fumo was the defendant in a criminal trial in federal court. And it was a trial that, in my opinion, was very likely to show a pattern of conduct that, while it might not have been illegal, was really questionable. So I sent 3 reporters to the courtroom every day, one person to come out of the courtroom at about 20-minute intervals and just file 3 or 4 paragraphs for the web. The idea there was that by doing this, doing it accurately and succinctly, Philly.com would dominate those who wanted to read about the coverage. Then I sent a second person named Jeremy Roebuck to cover the daily case, and at the end of the day, 6 o'clock, write a definitive 30-inch story about what took place. I then sent a third person, Craig McCoy, to observe the trial for 5 days and then try to produce something for the weekend that no one else would do. So this was, in modern parlance, an inefficient use of resources. However, in my opinion, the long-term benefits of those short-term actions, dominating the web, dominating the daily paper, and having something special for the weekend when people could read thoughtfully at their leisure, would make the Inquirer the dominant voice, the dominant communicator of news for this region. Today, my metaphor for what's happening is that reporters are being assigned to run marathons at sprinter's speed. Think about that. 4-minute miles for 26 miles. The result is that it's exhausting, and one can't possibly cover the news with the depth and the analysis that, in my opinion, is required.
I think also you have the pressure of the fact that there's only really one time zone left in the world, and it's now. And so this content has to be produced now, and the world is sort of streaming in front of us. So where do we take the time to sort of sit back and put a little context into what we're reporting on? Many reporters I speak with say they feel like they're nothing more than mic stands at this point, because they're not doing the analysis and the kind of comprehensive study that they would normally do on stories. And I know this all sounds very depressing, but it's the truth. The pressure is just enormous on them to be producing content at all times. And so the question we have to all decide is, what kind of information are we really getting when it's just streamed across all these platforms at the same time? You had 3 reporters. How many do that now? One reporter to do everything.
It's very rare.
Right.
So let me pivot off of that point with respect to technology and the need for reporters to always be producing content, I think is the way it was phrased. Last Friday, the New York Times published its updated social media guidelines for its own reporters. It told its people not to express partisan opinions, endorse candidates, or appear to take sides on issues that the Times is seeking to cover objectively. In response to the New York Times saying that, there was a piece in the New York Post describing it as nothing more than an effort to hide reporters' bias. A writer by the name of Mickey Kaus appropriately tweeted, that the new policy is a, quote, a massive effort to suppress the truth and make it look like, this is now David Uberti at Splinter, make it look like the Times plays it down the middle. How can a journalist with integrity navigate these social media waters?
I think it's part of their professional standards to always walk the middle. That is what we are called to do, regardless of how we may feel about something personally. When you go to work, you kind of hang up your opinions and you get to work, and your job is to provide fair, accurate information to the public. And if you have a Facebook page where you are talking about your own political beliefs, and yet you are branded with that publication or that station, they will lose institutional credibility if they have reporters who are out tweeting and giving their opinion on events. I think their job is to always appear to be the neutral voice in the flow of information, and not look like they are taking on one side or another unless they're a columnist or an opinion writer.
Yeah, if I can observe, I think you all in the legal business or headed into the legal business need to be a part of solving some of these complicated issues, and this is one of them. It ain't going to get solved by journalism or journalists, but this is very much a First Amendment issue. Is Ginger, a reporter, free to express herself, or does she belong to the brand? And I can probably make a better case, because I was an editor longer than anything else, that she belongs to the brand and that her job is to uphold the brand. And in doing so, she's not hiding her biases. She's, in fact, being sort of required to be fair in every way. But there are a bunch of issues like that, and we'll probably get into some more of them, but is there a way to regulate Twitter and Google and Facebook in a way that media hasn't been traditionally regulated in this country, without violating First Amendment rules? So those are the kinds of questions that actually the lawyers can help us with.
I think there's a fascinating case that's just occurred in the last week or so, and that is some of the websites that check facts. PolitiFact is one. Across the top of their website were ads that had been automatically placed there by Google, and the ads had stories that were not factual. They were basically to attract readers and clicking on them. And when you clicked on them, it ended up false stories with ads ultimately for skin cream. And the reporters, I think it was for the New York Times, interviewed the editors at PolitiFact and the other place, and they said these ads get placed there automatically. They don't have control over them. So in my opinion, some of the dominant places like Google really need to monitor what they're doing, spend the money to make sure that they are not unwittingly fooling the public.
But that's all based on algorithms that determine search engine optimization, if you're aware of that. It's what gets placed at the top of the Google search, right?
And in my opinion, Google has a responsibility to figure out what's false and what's not. But I thought the irony of having these false stories at the top of the political fact-checking sites was unbelievable.
Yeah, and the issue I'm throwing out there is that I'm not sure that's going to happen voluntarily. So if it's not going to happen voluntarily, how does the society solve that?
They're trying to find ways to monetize the news. Have you all heard the expression clickbait? Well, so you're smart enough to know that every time you go to a story that you have to click 25 times to read the whole story, you're being sucked into clickbait. And The organization that publishes that story gets paid for every time you come back and look at that story. And where that's really playing out is where the remarks come in at the end of, say, a print piece or an online story, and then people can come and say, well, here's what I think. Well, what one newspaper was doing where I lived was they had employees who did not identify themselves as employees, but they were called community engagement specialists. And their job was to go to where the story was and make a remark to kind of start flaming up the churn. And then they knew somebody would make a comment. And people love to come back and read, did anybody comment on my comment? And every time you do that, they're making money. So these people were employees of the paper, were not identified as such. They were just sort of like, you know, Susie 123 in the remarks section. But their job was to keep things moving, keep it flamed up and keep it moving. And the public, of course, doesn't realize that that kind of massaging of the information is manipulating them into thinking they're having a more honest discussion than they really are.
I think we had a question in the back. Yes, sir.
Thank you. In the interest of self-government and self-policing, integrity, assuring your consumer that what you're saying is truthful, many companies have and industries have stressed this in the way they operate. And I wonder, why is there a movement, it appears, within the publishing business, newspaper business, to get rid of the public editor? That's happened now several notable times, and I just wonder, why is that the case? Why is this industry different from, other industries in that regard?
Thank you. And let me just add one bit of context to it. You weren't spying on my notes, were you?
No.
Okay. Because we were going to talk about the public editor, and the one that's one of the more public examples of that was this summer. The New York Times did away with its public editor position, and in its explanation as to why, one of the options it offered its readers was more of an opportunity to comment, more of an opportunity of a reader forum, the idea of crowd fact-checking, and whether that ends up being in a civil discourse or not is a different question. But with that just small bit of added context, I throw the gentleman's question to the panel.
In my opinion, having a reader's representative is a worthwhile endeavor. At the Baltimore Sun, I inherited a reader's representative. At the Inquirer, there had been one. When I returned, that person was gone. But I think having someone to answer the public's concerns directly is worthy of doing. My hunch, and it's only a hunch, is that the reduction of ombudsmen has been economic more than anything else. Although at the Times, it seemed that some of the criticism from their last ombudswoman was a little sharper than previous readers' representatives.
Their job is to also explain the process as well as address concerns, so you have a better idea of how these stories come to be. And the ombudsman at the Cleveland Plain Dealer wrote what I thought was a very frightening column on the reality of new journalism is that it is no longer important to be right as much as it is to be first. And because of having to respond in live time to events that are occurring, they want to have information out there. So to me, that's scary when a news organization says, don't worry about being right, just be first. We'll update as we go along, because that begins to create false narratives. And then the first story is the one that everybody kind of goes with, but quite often it's wrong. You're just kind of learning things as the facts unfold. Look what happened in Las Vegas, the conspiracy theories that rolled out immediately. And yet, as the facts begin to emerge, there's a whole different story there. So I know it's hard to be covering news in an internet age where you have to be delivering all the time to an audience, but you lose something in the process. You lose that ability to really make sure you're getting it right.
If I can add a couple things, it's a mistake, I think, to be getting rid of the public editor or the ombudsman, although there weren't that many papers with an individual like that. But when your credibility's under attack, it's stupid to be getting rid of the person who's essentially trying to represent the folks on the outside. But a couple other points. A, it's a profession without standards. So the simplest terms, like off the record, would be probably defined differently by the three of us. Because the journalism schools and the other people who teach don't teach a common set of standards, and there's no such thing as continuing legal education in the journalism business. Secondly, even worse than getting rid of the public editor is newspapers led by the New York Times are getting rid of their copy editors. And I say this as someone who basically hated copy editors, except for my wife. But writers, or especially in the online or print world, are much more likely to now write their story and deliver it without layers of editors who tried to make it right.
Before we go back to the panel, I think that this young lady had a question to ask.
Yes, going back to Ms. Casey's point about whether or not reporters' partisanship or the political affiliation should not bear into, either not be public or bear into the newscast. My sense is that there's a current distrust that there isn't bias in reporting, and that maybe that has led to so many newscasts. We know Fox News is considered as having one bet versus, the argument CNN. And maybe the generation feels like it's harder for people to really realize where their bias is. So at least if you know where it is, you know where it's coming from. Like it may be more honest. And so, for example, if you are openly, let's say you're openly a Republican candidate, and you present on something that would be opposed to your views, that might show kind of you really taking a more fair, neutral position on that, because that wouldn't be how your political leanings been. Do you have any kind of sense of that?
Well, my sense is, you're quoting cable news, and I think cable news is biased. I think they have editorial leanings on all those channels, and even the reporters who work for them, I feel very badly for some of them, because you can tell they're trying to check their biases at the door. They're working. This is their job. They're not supposed to be bringing their own, what they think about the story. If they're doing it right, they're letting you make that decision. I'm going to give you the information. I'm going to try to get, various voices on a particular issue, and then let the public decide what they think is right. But, they do have biases depending on the news organization. And so here's a reporter. They go out, they work really hard to do down the middle story, and they bring it in and they put it on the air, and they say, okay, thank you for your story. We're going to a panel now where we're all going to scream about it for the next 2 minutes. And, so they mix opinion and journalism together, and it ends up very soupy, and people really can't see where the edges are. And so, I know reporters get beat up on all the time today, but most of the reporters I know are working really hard to do the job right. The opinion people, the opinion leaders, they're going in to defend one particular viewpoint or another. And so I tell people, if you turn on a news program and people are screaming, That's not a news program. If they're yelling at each other, that's not a news program. That's an opinion show. And they usually pull the most extreme ends of the spectrum because why? It gets ratings when people are arguing. Why do you think they gave so much free airtime to Donald Trump? It's because every time they put a camera on him and he said something outrageous, they're just sitting there watching the register, right, ring up the ratings and, hence make money for them. So are the biases there? I think the biases are there depending on the organization, but for my experience, the people who are out in the field doing the daily job of trying to get it right, they know that they're not hired because of what they think about the story. They're there to provide a benefit to the public in providing you with the information about what's happened.
All right, we have 2 more questions, and then we'll turn back.
Okay, so my question is also for Ms. Casey. So you mentioned this need for, sorry, my voice is a little raspy. This need for the demand for facts as they are, like real-time facts. So I was wondering if these news companies were more geared towards the intentionalist perspective of just producing the facts, or more the consequentialist, just the results that they're producing.
I don't think they have time to even know what the consequences are because they're under so much pressure to be producing content. And they're parachuting in, as they refer to it, on stories they have no background on. Forget beat reporters. I know in print they probably still have a lot of beat reporters, but in television they're mostly younger people who don't have a lot of experience, and yet they're going to parachute them in on a very big story, and they're supposed to be providing you with an understanding of a story they don't understand themselves. And so that's a pressure. And a lot of them are younger. They pay less now than they did 30 years ago in this industry. So they're young, they're not making a lot of money, they're under pressure, they're trying to meet all of these deadlines. So in terms of the consequence, I think they're not even aware of the consequences of what they've done until later.
Thank you.
Yeah, the news, I'm not sure this gets to your point exactly, but the news organizations are playing to their base. And the irony of the media versus Trump is, it's like, who's playing to their base with more success? But they're all trying to make money based on who they think is in their base. And that affects deeply who gets hired and what they say on the air, or online, or in print. That's what it's about, And because the economics of just about every part of the news business are not healthy right now, that just drives even more energy toward satisfying my base customer. And there's nothing wrong with making money, but it can influence the quality of the facts out there.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, so
Professor.
one of the things that this conversation seems to have been touching on is that it's becoming more and more difficult to differentiate between news and entertainment. And I guess I'm wondering from a historical standpoint, when you think this shift truly started to happen, and if there what steps you would recommend so that we can unring that bell.
I'll take a crack at that. I don't have the timeline, but what I would suggest is for all of you who are serious about news and differentiating fact from entertainment, what I would suggest is to read broadly, read deeply, read skeptically. Make sure that you read some of the most conservative publications and some of the most liberal publications. I try to start out each day and read the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the New York Times editorial page. I look at the Washington Post editorial page, where my daughter's a reporter, and the Inquirer editorial page. That gives you a pretty good spectrum of opinion. And I think that it's too easy, especially in this era of fragmented media, for people to select one source of news that converges with their preferences. And that's not a way to be educated. It's not a way to be intellectually vigorous. You need to read broadly, deeply, skeptically. And I'll give you one example. Recently, there was a story in the news about President Trump and whether or not he was calling the families of soldiers who died, and his assertion that President Obama and previous presidents hadn't done that. First, I read the New York Times online, and that story led with the assertion that President Trump lied. I'm not sure they used the word lied, but misrepresented what had happened. And that was the crux of the first 5 or 6 paragraphs. Buried deeply in the story was the fact that later in the discussion, a reporter asked him the question again, and he modified what he had to say. It was clear he knew he was wrong, and he backtracked somewhat. I then read the Washington Post because I wanted to see the difference. In the Washington Post, the story started out with his initial assertion, and within 2 or 3 paragraphs, they said when a reporter asked a follow-up question, he backed off and changed what he had to say. The Wall Street Journal gave it 1 line. So this is a good way for a in-depth reader and a skeptical reader to see the possibility, the whole truth. And in my opinion, that was one of the rare times where the New York Times didn't cover a story properly. I thought the fact that he changed his statement should have been higher in the story. So read deep, read skeptically, and read broadly.
But to your question, really, it began to change as the economic pressures began to intensify in the 90s and beyond, and it was cheaper to deliver opinion and sensational news, for want of a better term, and entertainment. It was cheaper to deliver that than it was to deliver. I don't happen to believe that there is unbiased reporting to the earlier question, but there was a little bit more of an effort before that to deliver unbiased reporting, or for a period of time anyway before that. Partly because it's cheaper, partly because you're more likely to satisfy your base audience if you know what kind of entertainment they want. It really began to change. I do think, if I can say one more thing,
of course.
This business was never perfect, and when you roll back decades, it was seriously imperfect. When the robber barons of journalism were running the papers based on their own particular tastes, it was really screwed up. So it probably got a little better, and then it got a little worse again. And here we are now with a very uncertain future.
In answer to your question, I saw it starting to unravel when Rupert Murdoch came to the United States and began buying up news organizations. And the first thing he did, I don't know if you're all familiar with who he is, he owned the Sun newspaper in London, which always famous for its page 3 girls, always have a topless woman on page 3. And I think they still do. It's unbelievable they do, but I think they still have their page 3 girls. And he came to America, and the first thing he began doing was tabloiding up news programs. One of the first shows he produced was a very young Bill O'Reilly hosting a program called Current Affair, in which they took news stories and kind of turned them on their head, and suddenly you've got sound effects and soundtracks and all kinds of brash reporting going on. Another show he brought and produced to America was the Jerry Springer Show, that bastion of great journalism talk. So, he knew it was like getting people in the tent. He wanted eyeballs on the screen. And, eventually television newscasts began to look a little boring compared to these tabloid news shows. And what I saw roll back was 20 years of women struggling for equality on a news set. You know, when I started out in the business, it was all homecoming queens and their avuncular-looking father, who was the real authority on the show, and then the woman was sort of the eye candy. And we fought very hard to be taken as equals. That was very important to us. And I remember at one station I was working at, I was new, and we were doing cut-ins for the newscast later in the evening. And you know what a cut-in is? You know, it's like a 20-second promo, and you cut them, and then they run during the commercial breaks leading up to the news. And I was sitting on the set, and the floor director said, "Oh, the director wants you to sit in the main anchor chair." And I looked up and I looked around and I said, "I am sitting in the main anchor chair." And what they were trying to tell me was they wanted me to sit in my co-anchor's chair. But to them, that was still the main anchor. And, you know, we fought hard against that, and we eventually got to where women were hired more for what was under their hair than the color of it or what it looked like. But I see that rolling back now. I see women looking for tight sleeveless dresses and news directors telling them they need to wear mink eyelashes on the news and hair extensions. And I keep saying, you know, sisters, you need to not just lean in on this, you need to push back because you're throwing your own career under the bus on this. So things have been evolving, and as Zack said, sometimes, you know, the industry is getting it all right, and then it goes through a period where it has to reevaluate. And I think right now we are in a massive period of reevaluation in terms of what we think we're doing for the public.
Where do I get those hair extensions?
I don't know what you mean, I don't need them. Professor, and then we'll go on that side.
I'm just wondering if you could say something about the differences between the supply side and the demand side, causes and pressures. So on the supply side, there's things like there's a push towards content production, and maybe it's because technology, digital technology, the internet has driven down the costs of dissemination, and also of amateur production. So maybe the reason journalists are in such a rush to get there and just drop into a story they don't know anything about because they just, you know, they have to be in real time is because there's a bunch of amateurs with smartphones taking pictures and instantly uploading it. So to be relevant, you're competing with amateurs, and so there's this kind of idea of democratization of media through the technologies on the supply side. Versus on the demand side, what is it that people actually want? And if we can say that facts and news are really important, good quality journalism are important for democracy, but if people don't want it, and what they're looking for is cheap, quick entertainment, then the question is maybe, how do you go about thinking about it from the demand side, supplying people with something that they're not necessarily looking for. So it's one thing to say you should read deeply and widely, but that depends on people actually wanting to do it.
I think what's happened is a product of three converging factors. Number one, the belt tightening caused by the arrival of the web. And it's forced some of the best news organizations in America, including the New York Times, to seriously tighten their belt. The second is the existence of the web. Because the web exists, news can be instantaneous. And the third factor is competition. Because the news is instantaneous and we can cover it that way, everyone's going to try to do it. So those three factors, and I think that the web is a two-edged sword. It's great because it gives almost every one of us a voice. That's ideal in a democracy. It's also a drawback because anyone, however irresponsible, can communicate with thousands or tens of thousands of people. And to me, it's a conundrum. It has great benefits and great drawbacks. But I think that combination of economic necessity, the availability of the web, and competition is what is propelling this instantaneous journalism.
I think also, in terms of figuring out what people want, the media says it is a mirror. We're just reflecting back to you the culture you live in. But it is a mirror that, I say, shapes and reflects. And very rarely will you see a news organization take responsibility for conditioning the appetite of the audience. What people need is a good diet of meat, potatoes, and vegetables, but they gorge people on sugar. And they've learned that the audience will always go for sugar. And while it may be exciting and it may make money, it's not necessarily delivering on the mission. So to me, I see that as an issue as well.
I have a question to my left. Yes.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for being here today. Much appreciated. From my perspective, it seems as though we keep cycling back to this issue of, I guess, quality versus quantity, both of which are driven by different incentives. On the quantity side, as you've noted multiple times, there's this, I guess, continuing drive and hunger, especially for people in our generation, to be constantly supplied with new information. Obviously very much incentivized by different economic pressures. Money talks. But I think for me, the issue arises when money can talk as much as it wants, but when it's talking through the media, I would like for it to have something well-researched and well-founded to say. So that takes us to the quality side of things. And I think that circles us back to the focus of why we're here to discuss today, in ethics. And if journalists feel as though their job is to supply the public with well-founded, well-researched facts to stimulate, if you will, this public forum and this open public discussion, and this seems, in my eyes, to be almost an ethical implication for journalists. How do you suggest that journalists balance those two things in today's day and age, when obviously, as the professor said, the demand side of things isn't changing. The public's not going to change, so the burden falls on the supply side to make a difference. So how do you expect journalists to do that, I guess, in today's society?
Well, one of the things I think you need to be aware of is that certain news organizations are banking on manipulating you into certain points of view. Breitbart, for example, their editor recently spoke to a college group and said there was no such thing left as journalistic integrity. All there was now is the weaponization of information. And that's a lot different than having a goal of just trying to inform the public. And they work hand in hand with a company called Cambridge Analytica, and their motto is using data to change audience behavior. And both these organizations belong to Steve Bannon, by the way. And they're used, Cambridge Analytica is usually, politicians hire them to help understand where the public is and how they should be tailoring their message. So what you see is, you see organizations out there that aren't just reporting the news, they're reporting the news that they think will massage you into a particular point of view. And that's why I think it is so important to have so many sources of information. The gentleman up there spoke about Democracy Now!, which is a great news organization. But as Bill said, not the only great news organization. You should be educating yourself with the differing points of view so that you can get a better picture of say, the diamond. You know, the diamond has lots of facets. And so the more angles you come in on with a story, I think the better chance you have of really seeing it holistically. And then beware of the news organizations that are masquerading as news organizations, but they're not.
So, yes.
The question is, and a lot of people here may not be focused on Watergate, but as a person of a certain age, I'm frustrated with these people. So if Watergate happened today in the White House, as buried as it was at the time, would it ever be discovered?
So for those of you who perhaps couldn't hear it, the question was, if Watergate was happening today, given the state of professional journalism or media, including social media, would it have ever been discovered?
Yeah, I think there's a good chance it would be discovered, and I think there's a good chance that President Trump may be the best thing that happens to journalism in this age, restoring a little bit of sense of purpose and maybe clarity, you know, in an unintended way. Because Watergate, as you know, inspired a whole generation or maybe more of people to come into journalism, professionalize it, take it seriously, all of that. So I would hold out the possibility that the same thing might happen again with journalism under attack from inside and from outside. It can still happen, but personally, I am less worried about the big fish or the big crime. But I'm worried about all that's not being covered because the limited resources are being spent on the national anthem controversy, you know, as opposed to what's really happening in DHS or Health and Human Services or anything else. So I'm worried about that, and I'm truly worried about the quality of local news. A friend of mine was offered a job recently as the Metro editor in a town of 450,000 with another couple 100,000 people in the suburbs and 10 reporters. So it is impossible, and I think Bill would agree with this, it's impossible to do a decent job providing good local news coverage and that's with that sort of equation. It's a personal bias, but my fear is less that some big scandal in the national level will be overlooked. And I have a bigger concern about what the EPA secretary is doing that's not getting covered, or what's happening in Philadelphia that's no longer being covered.
So let me stay back in the 20th century for a moment now. We were talking a minute ago about Watergate. Back in the second half of the 20th century, how, if at all, did the media address the political divide that's always existed in this country when there weren't all the other outlets? And I guess I'll direct this to the two of you as editors of major metropolitan papers, how did you set the terms of the debate? Because at that time, you guys were maybe not the only game in town, but pretty darn close in having that conversation.
I think, speaking for the Inquirer of the 1980s and 1990s, literally every day that a major candidate was on the campaign trail, whether it was a mayoral candidate or someone running for governor, there was a reporter with that man or with that woman, day in, day out. The major issues of the day, if there were 6 or 7 major issues in the day, there'd be an in-depth analysis of every one of the issues. The editorial board of the Inquirer interviewed every candidate, whether it was a city council person, state senate, state representative, the courts, and the appellate courts. And I think as a result, people had a pretty good idea of the major issues, the major candidates, and the Inquirer's editorial page opinion. Today, it's far harder to get down to the level of common pleas court or municipal court and interview the same number of candidates and provide the same insight. I think the same pertains, as Zach was saying, in the coverage of local government, which I think is one of the most drastic needs for local newspapers and media outlets. My first editing job was right here in the Pennsylvania suburbs. I was the editor of a section called Mainline Neighbors, a tabloid that came out every Thursday, every Sunday, and then a sports supplement on Monday. The Thursday section was about 48 tabloid pages. The Sunday section was 64. And the Monday sports had a photo and a game story of every single boys and girls game in 17 communities. I had a staff of 12 full-time staffers and 6 correspondents and an assistant editor. and I thought it was the greatest job in the world because I got to cover David Girard-diCarlo's alma mater, Harrington High School. And I'd grown up in Havertown, so it was just great. And I thought this was really ideal public service journalism. There wasn't a lot of investigative reporting, but if you wanted to know the issues, the people behind the public facades, what happened to Katz Pharmacy at the corner of Eagle and Darby Road when it was taken over by a Vietnamese family that had the same aspirations as Milton Katz. You could find that in Mainline Neighbors. The economics of our industry have precluded doing that. In my opinion, that is really lamentable for the industry, but most importantly for the public.
Yeah, I personally, I don't think we were doing a great job of covering what they now call the culture wars and the some of the big economic divides that separate us now as a nation, that keep us from understanding what our fellow Americans are thinking or feeling or suffering. You know, I've just come from the Pendleton Roundup, you know, where the Pendleton, Oregon, it's a great party, I should say. It's like a Mardi Gras for cowboys, but it's. They don't make Pendleton woolens in Pendleton, Oregon anymore. They make them in Mexico and China, and you can visit a faux storefront in Pendleton, you know, if you want to see what a Pendleton woolen looks like. So those kinds of issues, we're definitely not covering well now, and I don't think we were covering well then.
So then let me bring us back to the modern time, and then we'll get to Mr. Chair in just a second. Now where the editors and the producers and the TV stations aren't setting the terms of the debate as forcefully, because they can't, as they did decades ago, we see people, and this room, I think, Zach, you're right, is not necessarily a representative sample, who get their news from algorithms. They get their news from Facebook, they get their news from Twitter. And oftentimes what that means is they begin to go into what some would call echo chambers. The algorithm knows that you like it when a certain type of news story shows up because you click on it, and it gives you more of that. Harvard law professor Cass Sunstein's recent book, #Republic, says that social media companies like Facebook can sort us ever more efficiently into groups of the like-minded, creating echo chambers that amplify our views. It's, according to some, the death of serendipity. I wouldn't know what I would read when in the 80s I picked up the Inquirer, and something I would never have otherwise cared about suddenly made a difference to me because you made a choice. How is it, I know you said to read expansively and skeptically and, what was the third one? It was good.
In depth, in breadth.
So read deeply, read broadly, read skeptically. But that's a lot of effort. My Facebook feed is just there waiting for me in the morning. Is it really a problem that I've lost this serendipity in my news?
Well, Steve, it is a problem, and I don't think it's a problem for you. I'm on Facebook. I have thousands of friends. I'm on Twitter. All of you are welcome to friend me. I post and tweet every day for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to call attention to work in the Inquirer that I think is meritorious, or work in other publications, particularly about issues of freedom of speech and freedom of the press that I think are important. And some of the articles I post create intelligent conversations It's fascinating. On Sunday, I posted a piece about Herm Rogel, a sports writer for the Philadelphia Bulletin, which went out of business in 1982. And at least 10 or 12 people started debating the relative merits of Herm Rogel and the Bulletin. Same way with issues of more serious import, like the First Amendment. So I think that Facebook and Twitter have their place, but it shouldn't be, by any means, the sole source of news and perspective.
But people don't have a lot of time to be reading all day long different publications or watching different programs, and I am really concerned about how polarized we've become. It's like the middle is gone, and you're either going to be on this side or this side, the black or the white, or this end of it or that end of it, where in my experience as a journalist, the truth is always kind of in that gray area where the two places come together is really where you get a fuller sense of a story. If all you're doing is hanging out with people who agree with you journalistically, you're not learning anything. You're not discovering anything. And although I think, newspapers may well become, antiquated over time, there's something about a publication that I open it in the morning, and maybe I wasn't interested in reading about this. I have no idea what this is, but you know what? I'm going to read this story, and wow, I learned something, as opposed to going to news sources that are just propping up your pre-existing conceptions about the world. That's why, again, one news source is not going to give you, unless, I have my own bias on what I like. I like good old boring PBS. But on the other hand, I try to read very widely, like Bill says. But not everybody has that time. Not everybody can spend that much time reading in the course of a day. So that is a challenge, I think, for all of you in terms of deciding for yourselves what's really going on.
I had one thought that particularly I think is relevant for all of you law students, and that is, to me, the hallmark of a really good in-depth story is that the story has captured the two poles of the possible truth. And I think one of the lessons that I learned with increasing importance in my years as a journalist was to try as hard to master the other side of the story as you do the story itself. And when you master the other side of the story, one of three things happens, and it's just like a good trial. Number one, it can add nuance. Life, as we know, is not black or white. It's not 0 or 100. It's gray. So when you're writing about a controversy and you master the other side of the story, just like in a trial, you add nuance. You add depth. Second possibility, the other side of the story can be such utter poppycock. For instance, the Abscam defendants who claimed they were taking the money to run their own undercover investigation, that it adds muscle to your central thesis. It demonstrates that the other side of the story is incredible. The third possibility, and this has happened to me, and I wish I had the time to spin the yarn, you listen to the other side of the story, and it totally changes your preconception, so much so that you either have a different story or no story at all. So mastering the other side of the story is important. And I'll direct your attention, I'd urge you to read a story that the Washington Post did this week on Tom Marimow, state representative from Pennsylvania, who was President Trump's likely nominee to head the White House Drug Office. The Washington Post revealed that he had been a sponsor of legislation that really helped the drug makers dispense opioids more easily, despite some objections from top DEA officials. When you read the story, you'll notice that Representative Marimow would never talk to the Washington Post. And they tried. They wrote letters. They called. They sent emails. Scott Hyam of the Baltimore Sun, someone I hired at the Sun, who's now at the Post, did the story. And I've always suggested if someone won't talk with you, write the person a letter. document the fact that you really want the other side of the story. At any rate, the Capitol Police were called out to intercede so that Scott Hyam couldn't talk to Representative Marimow. So it's important, you know, as a lawyer and as a journalist, master the other side of the story. If you can't get the other side of a story as a journalist, you've immunized yourself against a defamation suit because you have not recklessly disregarded the truth. To the contrary, you've gone to the utter greatest lengths to master it, and you failed, not because of your efforts, but because of the person you were trying to interview.
In the time that we have left, it's probably worth talking just for a few minutes about Twitter and the president. I expected that reaction. And my question, to some extent, is are we really in a different era of ethics, integrity, and civility? Or is it really just a different version of what we've seen in the past? This past summer, President Trump tweeted that his use of Twitter was, as he put it, modern-day presidential. Modern-day presidential. That includes tweets last week about how, with all the fake news coming out of NBC and the networks, at what point is it appropriate to challenge their license? Bad for the country. And a comment at a news conference also last week, and I quote, "It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write, and people should want to look into it." So, wow. How does an ethical media respond to that kind of a comment? And then we'll talk about what others might have done.
Well, you haven't included the part where he calls us disgusting, scum, enemies of the people. You know, the press and
that
the
was implied.
Yeah, well, that's a given. I think it's very dangerous when you have anyone saying you can't believe anyone but me. And I think there is a concerted effort out there to destroy the media and muddy it up so much that the public is left very confused about what is really true. Fake news, that term that he has come up with and has so successfully spread throughout the culture, isn't a story, doesn't mean you disagree with a story. A fake story is something the Inquirer would put on their cover, like "I was Bigfoot's love slave" is my favorite quote. And, you know, pick a headline, you know, Martian appointed to be ambassador. I mean, they're crazy headlines, but that's fake news. It's silly. Everybody's in on the joke. Fake news is also when you say that Hillary Clinton is running a sex slave operation out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And everybody thought that was pretty funny until the guy showed up with the gun and blew off the doorknob because he thought it was true. And today, that pizza parlor owner is still paying for private security for himself and his family. Okay, so then it's not funny anymore. All right, so that's fake news. Biased news is news with a political point of view. Fox News or MSNBC or Democracy Now! They all have a particular point of view, but they're usually pretty clear about what they are. And then there's wrong news, and that's when journalists make mistakes. And it happens, you know, when we're talking about how rushed they all are, you do run into some competency issues. People do make mistakes because they're in a hurry, but usually news organizations will make a point of saying, okay, we got this wrong. It happens really so seldom that they make movies about it when it does happen. They make movies like Shattered Glass. There was a reporter for The New Republic who was simply fabricating all of his stories. But it's important to know the difference between what's incorrect, which is usually corrected by credible news organizations, what's biased, and then what is completely made up.
I'm not offended by his use of Twitter. In fact, I might even appreciate it because it's a little bit more likely to reveal his feelings, you know. I am offended by particular tweets, and I'm particularly offended when when you see the broadcast or read the story or the online account in which that tweet hasn't been put in some context or analyzed or put up against opposing information. So he's using a modern day tool, and I don't mind that. But I do think it's the responsibility of a responsible media, if it still exists, to put that tweet in some perspective, or decide that it's really just not worth that much attention.
But it is worth attention.
It's not always worth attention.
I think everything the President of the United States says is important.
You make a judgment, as a professional, you make a judgment that this, if we roll it back a quarter century or something like that, you made a judgment that this was news and this is not, and this statement by the mayor or the governor, this is news and this is not. And so it's okay to decide that this X tweet is not worth attention.
What would have happened if Frank Rizzo had Twitter?
Well, his thumbs were too big, to tell you the truth. But in a sense, he did. He allowed, it was a different era, and he allowed easy access to himself. And so his constant, unfiltered statements were generally available to the media that was covering them. And we were making a judgment about whether or not it was worth covering or not. In a sense, I mean, we're talking about a number of different things today, some of them that have relevance to the society as a whole. Ginger's point about polarization isn't about the media as much as it is about the world, the nation we live in. How a public official gets covered, what chooses to be covered, how much bias is in that. They've always been issues. So if the Bambino had Twitter, he would. I'm not sure that life would have been that much different.
All right, I know we have 2 questions, and then we are just about out of time.
On the point about, thank you. On the point about the sort of intersection between traditional news media and social media such as Twitter, do you feel that social media websites or any form of social media have different or the same obligations as traditional news media outlets in terms of fact-checking, essentially?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, let me add a little bit to that in terms of the fact that Twitter isn't necessarily it's people posting either their own thoughts or a news article or a fake news article or whatever from other people, whereas a news source is creating the content as opposed to just disseminating it. Do you think that there are obligations there that are different or the same, or how do you think that interplay works out?
I think if you're going to call yourself a news organization, you do have a responsibility to be checking the information that you're passing on, as opposed to, say, being a blogger, which it really doesn't matter unless, of course, you wander into legal territory of defamation or libel. But I think if you're going to call yourself a news organization, you should have a set of standards that you adhere to. The problem now is anybody can get credentials. I have a friend who is probably, arguably, the chief political reporter in the state of California. He was at a news conference, and he couldn't get over how many people were in the news conference, how many reporters were there. Normally, there was just a handful of people covering these kinds of events. And so he got a chair next to a guy and said, well, who do you work for? And he says, well, I don't really work for a news organization. I'm a dentist from San Bernardino. But he got himself some news credentials, and he blogged, and now he's sitting in the room with all the other reporters as an equal. And what often happens in those cases is people, because they do have very strong opinions about the world, they'll start yelling at the people holding the news conference, calling them murderers or criminals. And the response isn't that these organizations start to vet who gets the credentials. The response is they just don't hold news conferences anymore. And then who's that helping? It's not helping the public. So I think it's very important when you read things that you also know who you're reading, and are they journalists, or in which case I think they should adhere to a set of standards, or are they just bloggers who are just going to tweet their opinions, in which case they're totally entitled to do that, but self-identify, in my opinion, self-identify who you are.
All right, we could keep doing this, and I wish we could, but the time has elapsed. I want to take a moment to thank our panelists very, very much. And to thank all of you for coming.